This video is a review of Chapter 5, Best Practices, and the final chapter in this workshop. Inside Chapter 5, you'll find, firstly, how to be able to select the most appropriate data visualization based on the variables that you're using. You'll also find aesthetic mappings to use, like color and size and shape, and those are used to be able to depict a third variable. So typically, we're only depicting two variables in a typical XY axis or a Cartesian plane. However, in this case, we can actually use things like color, size, and shape to add a third or even a fourth or fifth variable. Although when we show that many variables, we tend to risk overplotting. And overplotting creates a busy visualization that makes it difficult for audiences to kind of really get your main idea. It can obfuscate your message. Lastly, we talk about different techniques to polish and refine a visualization, and I'll look at a pretty terrible data visualization. It took a lot of work to make it that terrible. We'll go through a few steps that we can do, and I'll talk about each of them. But I honestly, genuinely recommend that no matter where you are in this course, that this be the chapter that you read, you go through bit by bit, and you really absorb every single part of this particular chapter. So don't just rely on the overview, because this is really the meat and potatoes of making a visualization as elegant, as efficient, and as effective as possible. And what's more, this is really where you learn to not only show respect for your audience, but respect for your work, respect for your reporting, and respect for process. And so it's really something that I think you'll want to spend as much time on, not only in proportion to the rest of the time you've spent in this workshop, but it also kind of reflects the amount of time that you'll want to spend on your visualizations in order to make them publication quality, highly polished, and decodable, decipherable, and interpretable to broad audiences. So let's look at some very common data visualization families and types that you can use. So first of all, most often is a scatter plot. Now this is because scatter plots depict two variables. Typically, they can depict more with aesthetics, but we're just simply focusing on Cartesian plane XY axes. And so two variables, and both variables have to be numeric. They can be continuous, they can be discrete, but they ultimately have to have some form of numbers in there. Now, what I've done here is actually taken this proportion, and this is the proportion of unique lyrics out of the first 35,000 lyrics, and also name length. So in other words, how many characters are in the name of the rapper. So GZA obviously has 3, Jedi Mind Tricks, a little bit longer of a name, has 16, and Del the Funky Homo Sapien takes the cake with 24. So again, if we want to create a visualization, all we're doing is highlighting the two arrays or the two columns, the two variables that we want to show. And the most appropriate chart is going to be a scatter plot. Let's see if Excel recommends that. So we click on Insert, we click on Recommended Charts, and it gives me something a bit funky. Let's click on Scatter Plot and see how that turns out. Cool. So in this particular case, we have name length, and then we have the proportion of unique lyrics. Now, do keep in mind that these are the top 15 most lyrically diverse, so we don't have all 159 or some odd rappers that are included in here. We can't see the full range, but you do get the point, hopefully, that here we can see that there's really not a strong relationship among these 15 rappers for any particular reason. But you might have hypothesized, oh, maybe if they have a longer name, it means that they are, in fact, more lyrically diverse. So that doesn't seem to be the case among the top 15, but who knows what we would find if we were using the entire data set. So again, that's a scatter plot, and we're showing kind of two numeric values on the y-axis and on the x-axis. The next most common type of visualization is actually called a histogram. And a histogram is used, again, these are the same 15 top wrappers, so I don't think we're going to see a lot of variation. But a histogram is typically used for a single variable, and that's all it's showing. So if you want to show the distribution of a single variable, let's see if it's recommended. And in fact, it is not. That's a clustered column chart. Let's do all charts. So a histogram would be technically a bar chart. Let's see if we can find it. Oh, there we go. Okay. So again, this is not a lot of variation. You're getting what a histogram essentially shows is how many of your observations, that is your rows, will fall into these buckets. And these buckets are between 5,803 words and 6,503 words. So you've got this bucket with approximately 13 artists falling inside there. You have no artists falling in 6,503 to 7,203, but then we have 2 artists that fall in this much higher bucket. And this is actually kind of interesting. Now we can increase the resolution of this considerably if we wanted to. Series options. Oh, I'm looking at the series. Apologies. Let's go with changing the x-axis labels. Axis options, automatic, no. Let's do bin width. We'll change that from 700 to 100. Now that's going to give us a bit more resolution. So that's even more incredible because, again, we're looking at the dispersion or the distribution, and the top 2 wrappers are vastly more lyrically diverse than the 3rd and 4th wrapper. And so that's what we can tell from this visualization, which I think is actually kind of amazing. It's that GZA and Jedi Mind Tricks and Sage Francis are incredibly lyrically diverse and have huge vocabularies in their tracks. But A$AP Rock and Bus Driver just are utterly dope, for lack of a better term, in terms of their unique word count. So straight 5 for them too. That is a histogram, and again, we're looking at the distribution of a single variable, and it's a numeric variable at that. And it's letting us know how many observations fall within these different ranges that we've specified. So what about a time series? What about data that we'd like to depict over time? So in that case, typically we want to use what's called a line graph. And a line graph is relatively appropriate because it's easy to kind of see rises and falls, dips, crests and troughs, so to speak, in a pattern, in a series of values. And that's important to be able to identify patterns. And let's see what pattern that we can identify when we look at our data from 1979 to 2000. So here we have a line graph. Again, this is going to be a time series, also called a time series. So not all line graphs are time series, but typically this is what you want to choose if you want to show changes over time. And so we've got 1980 going into 1990. That's very interesting. So this is, these are the points from the poll for BBC Music 2020 and the greatest hip hop songs, tracks of all time. And so 1994 gets this huge bump because of Biggie Smalls, or the Notorious B.I.G.'s Juicy, which was considered the greatest song of all time according to the survey. And so there's that huge bump there, but you're also getting a lot of other artists around this time as well for these greatest tracks. And actually, if we do extend it out, it starts to get less and less. But you can really see that this was kind of at the tail end of the golden age of hip hop, where you had some of these, according to those polled, greatest tracks. So that's just an example of sort of the patterns that you can identify when you're looking at time series data, and why we use a line chart for that. So what about geospatial data? Well, we've looked at this before in a previous video, but I'll give it another shot. And we'll click Insert. Now, you have to essentially agree for Bing to allow you to basically use this chart. And it's just like a little yes or no thing. I don't think they use your private data or anything like that. But just to give you a heads up, I'm not showing that here, but it does happen. It prompts you when you try to use a graph like this. So this is what's called a choropleth map. And choropleth comes from the Greek word for change. And if I recall correctly, maybe quote me on that, but a dictionary is probably better. And in a choropleth map, here we have shape files. Each of these are obviously the shapes of states in the United States of America. But what's more, we have a quantitative value that's associated with each of those geographic kind of polygons, if you will, or these shapes. And so there are many different types of geographic data. And so choropleth maps are typically used for showing geographic areas, as opposed to a dot map, which might show, or a heat map, which might show the concentration of some area based on longitude and latitude coordinates. So those are points rather than actual large geographic areas. So this is just one example. And again, heat maps, right? We oftentimes, it's an election year this year, so we're going to see not necessarily choropleth maps, but we'll certainly see a lot of color-coded geospatial visualizations, especially ones that involve partisanship and so on and so forth. So lastly, that really covers all of the some of the most common visualizations, I should say, certainly not all of them. But what happens, we've only been mapping kind of two variables so far. In this, it was the states and the number of platinum albums that they've received. We've mapped the amount of points from this BBC Music poll and then the year. We've mapped, in this case, this was univariate or a single variable for creating a histogram showing the distribution of unique words by the top 15 artists. And then also we've mapped two variables here, the length of the artist name and then the proportion of unique lyrics. And so what happens if you want to map a third variable? Well, you can use something called aesthetics. Now, aesthetics include things like fill. When it comes to bar charts, you typically want to fill essentially describes the color of the bars. You also have color. So you can, if you're creating a scatter plot, your data points can take on certain colors, and those describe your third variable. But there are tons of other things. The size of data points, the dot dash pattern or the width of a line, for example, the transparency or the saturation in a choropleth map. So all of these are different ways to be able to show some sort of additional variable. So do keep that in mind. And one other thing is that I actually had to do a bit of reworking with this data to get it out of its normal shape. What this is essentially how many points, according to the BBC Music poll, that shouldn't be there. How many points, according to the BBC Music poll, did Tupac and the Notorious B.I.G., aka Biggie Smalls, and that is Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace, how many points did they earn each year from 1991 to 1998? Now, you can look into the data, and a lot of this might not make sense because, for example, some of these are posthumous releases. So in other words, after both artists were murdered, which you can go back and change these, and actually in the example that I use in Chapter 5, I do actually attribute some tracks, like, for example, Brenda's Got a Baby, to its original release date. That's a track by Tupac, and that was in 1992. So what we're going to do is map out not only the variable year, which it hurts to rearrange data like this because it's not how I would do it, but that's how Excel wants it, and that's sometimes what you have to do. I really can't emphasize enough that you have to mess around with your data. This is a perfect example of messing around with your data layer in order to create the sort of visualization that you want. So we've got the variable year, we've got the variable points, and then we have this third variable, which artist is it? So if we highlight all of this, let's see if Excel picks it up. In fact, it does. So I'm going to go with a column chart, aka a bar chart. We'll make that a little bit bigger. And sure enough, we see that we have a greater dispersion with Tupac in terms of creating some of the greatest hip-hop songs of all time, according to this BBC vote, between 1991 and releases in 1998. So that's a bit more dispersed. That distribution is more varied. However, there's more concentration, especially for Biggie Smalls, in 1994, which was a banner year for him, and then also a posthumous release in 1997, if I recall correctly. But again, this contains that hit, the number one song according to this poll, which got a whopping like 140 points or something like that. And that was Juicy. And so many of these points are just contributed or attributed to that single track. And so this is really, I think, a great example because there's a lot of debate about between who was better, Tupac or the Notorious B.I.G. And I don't have any particular answer for that. I think that obviously they're different styles of artists. And then certainly it relates to this broader geographic ongoing battle between East Coast and West Coast because Notorious B.I.G., aka Biggie Smalls, was from Brooklyn in New York City versus Tupac, who's over in Cali, in California on the West Coast. So I enjoy this visualization, and the reason aesthetics are so great is because by mapping this third variable, it adds to the richness of understanding that we can see that Tupac had just as much greatness in terms of his tracks as the Notorious B.I.G., although it was just spread out significantly more, whereas Notorious B.I.G. is concentrated in 1994 and 1997. So this is an example of using aesthetics in a visualization. And obviously there are multiple different types of aesthetics that you can use, and I recommend that you check out Chapter 5 because there's quite a large list of those aesthetics, but also there are objectively better aesthetics to use than others. And so it explores that a bit, and I encourage you to check that out, especially when it comes to choosing the right aesthetics for your visualization. Seriously, some aesthetics are simply better than others. There's no doubt about it. There have been studies done, et cetera, et cetera. So go check out that section in Chapter 5. And lastly, we have a monstrosity of a visualization. Now, I did not save the original visualization I used for Chapter 5, which emphasizes the message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five as being kind of a turning point in hip-hop, as well as kind of the origins of conscious hip-hop, or sometimes called political hip-hop. But I did try and recreate this somewhat, and it's using these data. These are the top 10 greatest songs of all time, according to the points that they received in this BBC Music poll in 2020. Now, there are a lot of things wrong with this, and we're going to kind of walk through each one of them right now. So, as I mentioned in the previous video, you can click on separate parts of a visualization, and you may have noticed that this what I'm showing you now is a bit bigger in terms of the real estate taken up by the screen, and that's because I wanted to have full view of what's going on in this right side navigation bar. And so, firstly, let's talk about visual hierarchy. So there is a lot of busyness going on here. And one of the things that we can do to eliminate that busyness is, first of all, this background, you don't want anything competing. There should be absolutely no competition in terms of what's competing or vying for your eyesight or the eyesight of your audience, right? You don't want them to say, oh, what's going on with this marble in the back? Or why is Dopus Tracks the title of this, presumably the title, why does it look that way? Why is it there? And then it's difficult to even make out, due to the color scheme, what's happening with the X-axis titles. These are actually the names of the songs. Juicy, Fight the Power by Public Enemy, all great tracks, of course. And so there's a lot of competition. So how do we start getting rid of that competition? Well, keep in mind visual hierarchy. So the background should never compete with anything in terms of your data, in terms of the non-data ink or the contextualizing elements in your chart or in your visualization. These really should come first, your data and then your contextualizing elements, as well as anything else like these grid lines that would help with kind of being able to decode or decipher your visualization a bit better. So let's get rid of that right now. I double-clicked on the background. This opens up the menu Format Chart area, and we're simply going to go into Fill, and we're going to select No Fill. And also we're going to get rid of the border as well, because we really don't need it. Actually, to make this a little bit easier to see, we're going to go with a white background and no border. But certainly that's already a tremendous improvement in terms of being able to decipher this, because our eyes are no longer competing, or the elements in this graph are no longer competing for our straining eyesight and the straining eyesight of our audience. So what else can we do in terms of visual hierarchy? Well, let's try and make all of these colors a bit more consistent, if you will. And so we'll have this sort of thematic consistency throughout the colors. So we'll change that to automatic, also automatic. So these are just simply black and black for the font colors. Dopus Tracks, we can just what we would want to do, this definitely should not have any sort of a curve to it, but anyways, we'll fix that in a second. But still, let's get rid of the fill in the background, and we'll also make that black as well. So, okay, so now there's a lot less distraction, because we're starting to see much more of a hierarchy. The data comes first, then the contextualizing non-data ink, like the title and the labels that we have for the X and Y axes, and then also the grid lines. I'll talk about, you know what, let's handle grid lines right now, just to fully emphasize visual hierarchy and its importance. Let's change the color of the grid line to something that is a bit less in your face, so to speak. So cool, let's go even lighter with that. Let's go even lighter. All right, so those grid lines aren't competing for our attention anymore, which is very nice. Now that's really making the data pop a lot more, but it's also being effective as a guide for us to see which one of these data series, which one of these bars, how tall they are. In other words, what quantity they represent. So that's extremely important. This really is the essence of visual hierarchy. So next we get into legibility. And of course, you want to have the most legible text as possible. Angles do not lead to legibility, so I'm going to go ahead and change that with custom angle here. And it's fun trying to make a bad graph, because you have to go to these things that you've never checked out before, just because you know it would be a bad idea to use that. But yeah, anyways. So I love to use a font, and you may have recognized this in the title cards or the thumbnails for the YouTube videos that I use. And the font that I use is called Quicksand. It's extraordinarily legible. It may not be one of the most serious looking fonts, but it's certainly no Comic Sans. And there we have a relatively legible font. We can lower the font size a bit. It's still easy to understand. And let's even move this. Actually, we'll get to where we should put the title in a bit. But right now, I'm going to just leave it up there. So cool. That is legibility. And in terms of legibility, there's a ton of different fonts that you can use. Calibri is perfectly fine. Arial is also very good. You want to use fonts that are typically sans serif. In other words, a serif font is something like Times New Roman. And you can see that Times New Roman has these little flaring kind of ends to them. So the top of the T comes out, the bottom of the T comes out at like this little base. And it has this kind of flare that's added to it. Same with the D, we have this kind of upper point and this lower point. And those are not necessary for actually reading. They just make them look a certain way. And that's called serif. So if you choose a sans serif font, like Quicksand, that's actually much more legible. And what's more, it's kind of an intrapolation of what we're trying to do with data visualization. What I mean by that is we're getting rid of any ink in our fonts that aren't helping us and in fact may be distracting us from understanding that font. And so we do the exact same thing. We follow the exact same principle with data visualization. Okay, so the next thing is chart junk. What is chart junk? Well, it was a term coined by Edward Tufte, who is a political scientist and statistician, and he is also considered one of the greatest gurus in data visualization of all time. He wrote works such as the Visual Representation of Quantitative Information, which is just a fundamental text and seminal text when it comes to the art and science of data visualization. And he's written a ton of other works and lectures publicly at different seminars and so on and so forth in best practices in data visualization. And so he coined the term chart junk. Chart junk is essentially anything in a chart that is unnecessary, that obfuscates the clarity of your message, that makes it just that much less efficient and effective because it gives your audience one more thing to think about. So what we have here is kind of a three-dimensional indentation to add some sort of depth or something or other in these bars in our bar plot. Why is that not good? Well, it doesn't tell you anything more about the visualization. Let me say that again. It doesn't tell you anything more about the visualization, about the data, principally. You learn nothing new by having these elements in here. And so that goes the same with shadows, with 3D effects. That's all chart junk. You got to get rid of it. So how do we do that? Well, I believe I used 3D format, which is something I never use. There we go. Cool. So we made that flat. Is it kind of a subtle difference? Yes, a little bit. But does it look a lot more professional and a little bit closer to being publication ready? Certainly. Again, anything that is non-data ink should help your audience 100% either to contextualize the actual data ink, and none of it should be unnecessary. If it doesn't help your audience understand your data and ultimately understand the ideas that you're trying to communicate and the stories that you're trying to tell with your data, get rid of it. It doesn't belong. And so next, let's talk about, there's not really any other chart junk in here, but I do want to talk about meaning. And when you have, this takes us to colors. And in fact, this is technically called fill because it represents an area as opposed to a singular point or a line where that would be actually color. If we had borders around these, that would be a color specification. But since we're talking about the inside of these polygons or these geometries, then it is, in fact, a fill. You can think of it like filling a glass of water. In this case, we're filling a very tall column with paint. So color and fill can mean things. And we saw this when we looked at aesthetics. Here, Notorious B.I.G. is represented in this orange, and Tupac is represented by blue. And so when you look at a visualization like this, half your audience, and especially the data literate, highly data literate audience members, are going to say, well, hold on, what should I be looking for? What is yellow? What is green? What is red? What do those represent? They don't represent anything. And so you're confusing your audience by adding, once again, something that borders on chart junk, but essentially a sort of an aesthetic that doesn't represent anything at all. It has no meaning. And you don't want your audience looking for meaning that isn't there. Right? So, cool. Let's go ahead and see if we can select all these at the same time. And we'll go ahead and change that fill to, I'm going to go with like a Dodger blue. No, that's a bit too light. That's not bad. Let's try, yeah. Okay, cool. Blue is not bad. I'm actually going to make these a bit bigger as well. Cool. That was with the gap width. So, awesome. So now our audience is going to look at this and not try and find a meaning that isn't there by trying to decode or decipher the meaning or the significance of differing colors in these series. So next, that takes us to labeling. Labeling you can think of as non-data ink. In other words, the blue here is data ink. It shows data. And then labels are non-data ink, but they're important for contextualizing your data ink, right? And so what we're actually missing currently here is the axes titles. And it's obviously very important to have that because you don't really understand what's being shown, especially on the y-axis. In fact, I'm going to get rid of the x-axis title. Yeah, you know what? Let's not do that yet. So we'll call this tracks because these are each a hip-hop track and the top 10 tracks of all time. And then here we will put total points. Right. And so labeling is important. What's more, we're going to do something else. But again, you're helping your audience to be able to understand your data. Now, when it comes to titles, I like to typically align these on the left. And that's just a personal choice for me. Where I align it, if I want to align it either with the values on the y-axis or if I want to align it with the, that's a personal choice. However, it is a best practice to be able to put your title on the left-hand side, not in the center. And why is that? Well, you want to be able to limit eye movement. You don't want an audience member to look at it at the center, then have to look over here. And we're going to talk about this more and do something much more transformative to be able to limit eye movement. But in essence, if you started at the left, you're not only limiting eye movement, but at least for Western audiences, where do you start reading? In, say, a paragraph or a book. You start in the upper left-hand corner. And so this is actually playing on both the visualization side of the brain as well as the reading side of the brain. And those are using kind of two separate faculties of the mind. And so that's a convention that you can follow. We'll talk a little bit more about that actually, we're going to talk about that right now. But actually, sorry, let's do one more thing with this. That title sucks. in terms of explaining what we're looking at. So a much more descriptive title is Top 10 Greatest... Again, I have a giant microphone in front of me, so apologies for the typing and typing speed. Top 10 Greatest Hip-Hop Tracks of all time. That might be a bit long. Let's go a bit shorter with that. Cool. And I'll need to realign that now. Opa. All right. So since we know that these are tracks, I'm going to go ahead and count this as just unnecessary. So I've actually just deleted the x-axis title because it's a bit distracting and we don't need it. We just simply don't need it, especially because this is the first thing that many audience members, many readers, end users, etc. will be reading, and they'll understand the context that these are in fact the top 10 greatest hip-hop tracks of all time. They may need to know what's on the y-axis, so we can leave this here. Okay, so we used a convention. Conventions are like, for example, green means good and red means bad, except when you're in, say, some certain Far Eastern societies where red is actually good luck and green is bad luck, so do keep that in mind. That's the same with the convention about creating data visualizations where elements are in the upper left corner. That is fine for Western audiences, but that convention reverses when you have Middle Eastern and Eastern languages. For example, Arabic, which starts reading from right to left. And so typical Arabic audiences, Arabic speaking and reading audiences would look in the upper right if they're using the reading part of their mind. So what are other conventions? Well, the darker something is, typically, like especially in a geospatial visualization, the darker the saturation is, that means the higher quantity. Different things like that. These are different conventions that we use oftentimes. And so you can think certainly of different conventions that you use all the time and leverage those, take advantage of those. So one thing that we're going to use is that in this case, there's a convention that related to putting your title in the upper left, and that's reading from left to right in a zigzag pattern. So what happens right now when an audience member is looking at this and they don't really have a lot of data visualization training? So they're going to probably read this title, which is, okay, we're off to a good start. And then they're going to look at this down here and they'll probably connect the 140 to the top of that bar. Maybe they'll go down just to see what track it is. Okay, they've identified it as juicy. They've gone back up to the top of Fight the Power. They've compared these two. And now they've gone back to the y-axis. They wanted to confirm what the y-axis really represents by this point. Okay, it's points. And this is all hypothetical, by the way. And now that they want to travel down here, read shook ones, travel across to 90s. Then they want to connect that again to the message. And so their eyes are going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so we don't want that. We want to limit eye movement, and we also want to take advantage of the left to right reading pattern that so many Western audiences are used to. So how do we do that? Well, I'm actually going to delete this and hopefully nothing catastrophic happens. We need to change our visualization layer. And what we're going to do with our visualization layer involves really actually putting this first in reverse order. So we'll select rank. We're going to go into sort and filter, and we'll do largest to smallest. That's going to reverse this order, but that's okay. And then we're going to change the style of chart that this is. So if you choose recommended charts, there we go. So this becomes then no longer a column chart, it becomes a horizontal bar chart. Now I'm actually going to change this. And one of the beauties of this is that, let's go ahead and set that custom angle to 0. Now, make sure we can fit everything in there. Now, in effect, these labels are also from left to right. And that's incredibly important because we no longer have to rely on kind of tilting our head sideways to read them as they were before. What did that look like? It looked like this, right? So here we were tilting our head to be able to read these. Never, if you can help it, use labels or text that is tilted or anything that's going to obfuscate the legibility of your text. And in this case, take longer for your audience to be able to decode your chart. So again, we move forward, and here we are with using this left to right zigzag reading convention. So that's extremely important. And again, that's using conventions, using strategies with which people are accustomed in order to sort of support and leverage, in order to kind of bolster the efficacy and the efficiency of your visualizations. Okay, so those are conventions. And lastly, I want to talk about respect for your audience. So one thing you may have noticed right off the bat is, and that's really I don't blame you if you did not notice this at all, but it's something that I think trained visualization consumers immediately look for, and that is a truncated axis. And so this is disingenuous because it seems like "Fight the Power" by Public Enemy is far outshined by Notorious B.I.G.'s "Juicy," and that's simply not the case. It wasn't. There's some visual deception going on here, and that's because this doesn't go all the way down to 0. It goes to 20. So you can go into Axis Options and make sure that is always 0, unless if you are going to truncate a y-axis, please be sure to tell your audience, hey, we truncated this y-axis, or point it out, because essentially you're deceiving your audience otherwise. And it could be accidental, but you do not want to lose face with your audience. There's lies, damned lies, and statistics, right? So one of the best things that you can do is keep them in mind when you respect them, when you make changes to your graph that don't force them to immediately question the veracity of your studies and the character of your person. So that all being said, we can add one more thing as well, and this is I'm going to extend this downward and move this a bit upward. Cool. I'm going to add a source. So in order to do that, we need to go to Insert. We'll do Shapes, and we'll use this text box. I'm going to select right there. We're going to make it quite small, probably 9. And we will make it, of course, quicksand to be thematically consistent. I'm going to start typing, but, we'll make some adjustments in a second. So source is BBC Music, and the year is 2020. Oop. All right, so now I've got that down there. I'm actually going to make this a bit smaller. Let's take it down to 8. Cool. And I'm going to align that with the graphical element that is most rightward. So that has some nice alignment. Alignment's always a good idea if you can help it. This I might actually even want to align over here. But again, we don't want to disrupt that zigzag thing. That's practically centered at that point. So keeping that in mind. And let's also lower this just a little bit. Cool. So awesome. We've in effect fixed the truncation in the x-axis, so we're no longer visually deceiving, and we can see that Fight the Power really has a close lead. Now remember, this is comprised of points, so people really identified Fight the Power as being like number 1 or number 2 of the greatest songs of all time. And it's very understandable. It was a turning point in hip-hop, which is very different from the sort of rags to riches story that's described in Biggie Smalls' Juicy, whereas Fight the Power by Public Enemy was really the introduction, taking conscious hip-hop to kind of a whole new level, especially in terms of urban identity and anti-authoritarian sentiments and sort of countercultural movement, if you will. So, those are really the big things. Again, we looked at visual hierarchy. We looked at legibility of your fonts. We looked at chart junk. If it doesn't help, get rid of it. We looked at meaning. So we made the colors uniform because colors mean things in certain visualizations. And so you don't want to confound your audience by using color inappropriately and forcing them to try and decipher some sort of significance that doesn't actually exist. We looked at labeling, and we wanted to make sure that our audience understands what this y-axis means and also has a more descriptive title. We looked at leveraging conventions like reading from left to right. And lastly, I'm actually going to jump in here and make that a little bit less in your face. Cool. And you can work on emphasis, and not every single non-data element, as we showed with grid lines, should be necessarily be black. They can be different shades of gray. So do consider that, keep that in mind. And in fact, you can make even things like source to be a little bit lighter of a color as well. But you want to make your data and your labels pop. Anything else that's contextualizing is just kind of an extra. Lastly, we talked about respect. We not only use conventions to make this easier for our audience to read, but we didn't want to deceive them, so we fixed the y-axis. And always keep an eye out. You never want to get caught in a gotcha, and you never want people to pull the wool over your eyes when they're showing you a data visualization. So just imagine how you would feel, right? We also included a source, so anyone can really check that out, and they can find out that indeed BBC Music did produce these data, and you can verify that for yourself. So that is in effect. Let's see if we can see this in by getting rid of the grid lines. We'll see if we can zoom in on that a little bit better. Cool. So that's our visualization. And obviously it was kind of a long journey from the monstrosity that it was. I can see something that we can fix right now. I'm not sure why that's happening. Maybe it's because it's zoomed in. I didn't even notice that. All right, there we go. I wonder why that happened. I feel like it was still correct before that. But anyways, there's a visualization, and again, huge improvement from the monstrosity that we saw earlier. That's it for Chapter 5. Again, I can't stress enough. Go dig into it and really understand the ins and outs of it, because there's a reason this is the longest video, and there's a reason it's also the thickest chapters. You're going to learn a lot more and get into the nitty gritty about these different visualization techniques and really what it means to create your visualization in a manner where it's effective, it is efficient, and it is elegant. Really makes your data pop. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. I absolutely loved creating this workshop, and I hope you enjoyed taking it. I hope that you were able to get some key takeaways. Do not forget to read the review and conclusions section that has a few final thoughts about the data that we worked with and how you can challenge those analyses as well. One of the beauteous parts of data analysis, data analytics, is that you can really challenge process and really get into looking at the data in a different way than people show you. So keep that in mind as well. Again, this has been absolutely incredible. I love data viz, love data analytics, love hip hop, and I love teaching. So this has been an absolute joy and a total blast to be able to put together. I really hope you enjoyed it again, and go out there and make some awesome visualizations that are respectful and that are publication quality and make people say, wow.